Alright, so here we are, got my canvas installed. Step one's gonna be projecting the portrait onto the canvas so we can sketch out all the main lines. And that way when we're painting, everything is in proportion. It's possible to just sketch it out of your head, but chances are it's not gonna be in the same exact proportions as it is in real life. Make sure that when you're doing this, write very lightly, because a lot of times the pencil lines, if they're too dark, they'll show through the paint once you start painting. So you want to make sure that you keep your hand very light. You don't need dark lines. You just kind of need to make sure that everything's in the right place. So now that the sketching is done, you can see it's very light, very dim. And let's move on to the painting process. So the first thing we're going to do is start off with flesh tone. And the flesh tone color looks something like this. It's either called peach or flesh tone. Typically like a light beige color. And this is what I normally start off doing my lines with. This is step one for me. Now when you're working on detail like this, it's best to keep the air at 40 psi or so. That's what I tend to keep it to. That allows you to get a little finer with the lines. Otherwise, if you have too much pressure, you're gonna have a hard time getting the really thin lines with the brush. You can even start laying out all the darker areas on the face. Like you see here, this side of the face, there's like a shadow there. So with this light color, you wanna fill in all those dark areas as well, including the hair on top also. Don't worry about getting overspray either, because later on down the line when we fill in the background, you'll be able to make those lines nice and neat. So you can kind of really, there's a lot of room for error when you're doing this first process. As you can see, you can already start making out the face just from literally spending about 10 minutes just laying out some of the detail with the light color. Now, if you can see, I've added some details to the face and the neck, and that's gonna be sideboard detail. So you can already make out the face, and that literally only took me maybe 15-20 minutes. Now I'm gonna go in with a darker brown and kind of follow this pretty much the same process. But what I will do is the parts that are lighter in the photo, I'm not gonna touch really. So like these light areas, I'm gonna use the medium brown to go over like most of the darker parts. That's gonna bring out more detail as well. And then what I'll do after that is go in with a white color and start bringing out some of the highlights, and then that'll give me more definition to then really start going in on the details. For the light brown, I'll be using the Createx brand light brown color. So this is where I'm at about 1 hour of progress. And I just want to point out that when you're working on these details and you're using the light brown, go very light with the lines. Especially on the forehead, the lines around the eyes, the wrinkles. Those are details that you don't have to, if you do them too dark, your portraits are just gonna start looking muddy. So you wanna go really light, and then you can always come back later on down the line and accentuate them a little deeper if you need to. But you'll notice that even as you build up, these lines that you make that are lighter, they're gonna still show through. So keep that in mind. That's very important. The next step after this, I'm gonna be coming back in here, and that's gonna be in the next session because it's already 11 and I need to take my ass to bed. But what you want to do is color match to the actual picture. So the flesh tone and the light brown are always going to be the same tone, but portraits vary depending on the person's skin color, depending on the lighting, depending on a lot of factors. So one of the key things is to match the colors on the portrait so that it looks a lot more realistic. And you'll notice on the picture, there's like yellow tones on some of the highlights. There's like a little bit of greens and blues that are like you can see on one side of the face. So the key thing is to take those colors that you see that are visible and you mist them from afar. You don't want to go too close to the canvas and make those colors too deep, because then all you want to do is accentuate it, because then all you're going to do is, like I said, make your portrait look really muddy. And that's a lot of mistakes that I've seen in my career that a lot of airbrush artists do. They tend to kind of overdo a lot of these details, and they get to a place where the portrait just doesn't look good, and then you can't go back from that. You pretty much got to start from scratch. So after that, I'm gonna come back in with white. Well, not white. I'll mix white with a little bit of flesh tone to make like a little bit of a milky white color, and that's gonna allow me to come in and accentuate some of the highlights on the face, and that's gonna make the entire face pop. Then once I get to that point, I stop adding details to the face, and then I go and fill in on the background and also on the clothing and some of the biomech details that I put on the face and the neck. Once I have everything laid out and everything's like, it's really, at that point, it's really gonna start like looking like a portrait. Then I start going in and doing all the small details, like the wrinkles on the lips, the wrinkles around the eyes, the hair, the fine hair details, the details in the ears. Right now, if I was to zoom in on this, it's not, none of this detail is fine. It's all like really, the lines are a little thicker. It's kind of like misty. You can make it out well from afar, but when you get close, there's not like fine detail in here. And the reason for that, like I said, is because you want to build up. As you build up, using these two colors in the background in the beginning, it's just gonna come together very nicely when you start coming back in with the darker colors and adding a lot of the highlights. So at this point, I start filling in on some of the accent colors that are evident in the portrait. As you can see, like on the right side of his face, there's like a little bit of a grayish blue there, some of the yellow tones. And I kind of miss these colors from afar so you don't saturate them too much, but this is an important process in color matching the portrait. So now I come in with a little bit of white and I start accentuating all of the highlights in the face. And this will really start to add some dimension to the portrait, and it'll start giving you a lot more definition. Ashley, come say hi to the camera. Anyway, so now that we've laid out some of the highlights, you see it starts looking more realistic. I've also, like you saw initially, I threw some of like the accent colors in there kind of vaguely. I missed it from like 1.5 feet away. You need to stop. The reason why I'm laughing is because Ashley's visiting me today because she's trying to learn. And she's over here making faces behind the camera. But anyway, so what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna come back in with the light brown and work on some more detail. And that's gonna bring out the details even more. I also gotta tone down some of the whites because I tend to kind of over highlight because then when I come back in with the brown, it's gonna tone it down some. And that's doing that repetitively actually just has a nice buildup and it starts looking a lot more realistic. So, and then I go into the darker brown and start really bringing out some of the darker details. So you'll see as I go along. Alright, so now I'm at a place where I'm comfortable filling in all the surroundings of the portrait. I got enough detail down, so what I'm doing now is switching my brush. Normally when I'm doing the portrait I work with a fine detail brush. My preferred brush of use is the Iwata HP BC1 Plus. It's a bottom feed brush and you get really fine detail with this brush and it's just like really smooth and doesn't feel like any of the other lower grade brushes. So, but to fill in all the space on the surrounding, I'm going to use a brush that has a slightly more thicker needle and nozzle, so you're going to get more paint out of it when you're spraying. So you don't have to sit there and like spend 10 hours filling in all the empty space. So I'm just going to do the surrounding, which I always do in green. That's like my signature, and as well as filling in some of the. He's wearing like a t-shirt with like a blazer, so I'm going to be filling that in also. And then also I got to come back in here and white out the detail, which I'm going to do the robotic portion of the portrait. So that's what I'm going to do next. Another thing I like to point out is that to fill in all the blank air, when you're filling in big area, bring up the pressure on the compressor. I normally do all the detail on the face at 40 psi. When I'm working on the surroundings, I typically bump it up to like 60 or 80 because you get more paint out of the airbrush as well. Typically when you're using the fine detail brush and you're using higher pressure, you don't get the same results. I find that my brush tends to clog up more and it just doesn't flow as smoothly as it does. The lines aren't as smooth when the pressure is high on the fine detail brush. When it comes to the filler brushes, whether it's something like this is a Badger Rage that I'm using. I also use the Pache VLs, which are like workhorses. They're typically used for like t-shirt airbrush because they just let out a ton of paint. So I'll either use that or use one of these to fill in all the surroundings. Also, I have a HPC, which I'm not sure where it's at, which is an Eclipse actually. An Iwata Eclipse is what I meant to say. I have an Eclipse that I use also for this kind of stuff because it's like the middle ground between the Pache that's like really thick spray and then the HP BC, which is like a really thin spray. So that's something to keep in mind if you're trying to figure out which brushes to get to do these kind of portraits. I mean, typically you can get everything done with one brush, but if you have multiple brushes, it's a lot better because obviously they serve different functions and you can get the work. You can switch depending on what you're doing and just get the job done. So. As you can see, I filled in the hair with a light brown before I actually started adding the hair detail. This actually helps add depth, and also you won't have those white gaps in between the hairs after you do the hair detail. Now I'm going to go back in with the brown, the light brown, and start bringing some darker browns into or just start adding more brown to the face to start darkening down the skin tone and make it more accurate, closer to the picture. Now I've switched over to my micron brush just because I'm going to be focusing on some of the smaller detail and I want to make sure that I have the thinnest line possible. So it's best to switch back to this brush at this point. Alright, so I think we're getting to a good place now. The next step for me is going to be, I'm going to go into matching the color tones of the face a little more. Right now it's looking very brownish in comparison to the photo. So there's like a grayish brown tone in there, like on the side of the face and like on this part of the face, which I'm gonna now start adding into the portrait to match it closer to the image. And it doesn't have to be 100% exact, so don't kill yourself if it doesn't look exactly like the photo. Color matching is actually very challenging, and it's not like 100% just like the photo, which can vary from device to device anyway, or from a print. If you're going off a print to do the portrait, it can vary also. The colors can vary. So the most important part is getting all of the color gradients in and all the detail in, and having the right contrast there and just as much detail and proportion as you possibly can. Because then once you don't have the reference photo next to the portrait, you won't even be able to tell the difference. So it's gonna look good either way. Alright, so now we're starting to really get some depth here. I've gone in and added the gray tones to the face and enhanced some of the darker areas. What I did was I kind of started with like a gray that I added a little bit of brown to. So it was a little bit of like a light gray with a little brownish like skin tone to it. That's how I started going into this area. And then I darkened it as I went. So after I kind of like laid out most of the color, then I went like one step darker by adding a couple of drops of black and a little bit more brown, just so you don't lose that a little bit brown tone that you get from the skin. And then I went in and did kind of like some of the gradient darker details. And then I went in with a really dark brown to really start going into like the shadows and stuff like that. And as well as some of the hair detail that's like around the face. To kind of fill in some more of that, and also the eyebrows. You would have noticed that I went into the eyebrows some as well as some of the dark shadows here, like below the nose, on the side of the mouth. So what I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to be first adding some color to the lip. There's like brownish, pinkish. It's like brown mixed with pink, like a slight drop of purple. So for that, I'll put like a tiny spinch of blue in there, just to really get that color right. I'll be doing that as well as like adding some color to the tongue. And then I'm gonna be coming back in with the white right after that to start really bringing some depth out and putting in some of the really sharper highlights in the portrait. Later on down the line, you can always choose to use a paintbrush to like on the teeth, the eyes, which I might do on this one, depending on how well I can get the detail with the airbrush itself, which should get me to a really good place. And then I'm gonna come back in with the brown, the light brown, which I use pretty much across the board throughout the whole process to continue to bring out skin detail. So once I add the highlights, then I kind of detune the highlights, because in some parts I will over exaggerate on the highlights a little bit, because then I'm gonna come back in with the light brown and tone down some of those areas that aren't supposed to be that bright. But what this does is just, it adds depth to the face. 95% done at this point. If you would have seen on the time lapse, or you would have noticed that I went back and forth between light colors, dark colors, whites, browns, dark browns. It's kind of a build-up process towards the end to really enhance the colors and the details in the portrait. This particular face was a little bit tricky because as you would have seen on the picture on the screen, there's like just the color shading. There's like, it's very brightly lit, so there's high contrast in the photo. Then there's like some colors that you can't really tell kind of like what they are. If it's like a brown or a gray or like a sand kind of color. So it kind of takes a little bit for you to master the process. But I encourage you guys to try. If you've never done portraits before, if you have a different method, try to implement this method because I think it yields pretty good results. I'm probably not the best portrait artist out there, but I think my portraits are, you know, among the better looking ones out there. So if you like, or if you see that this process might work for you, then I definitely encourage you to try and to share this with anybody else that you know may be looking into either doing portraits via airbrush or looking to get into airbrushing. Somebody that's already an artist that might do portraits using other mediums like acrylics or oils or even color pencil drawings.